I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: should franchises have a canonical rewind point? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because I've gone to the viewer mailbag and I've received the following message from Shefflin. Hi Brendan, to frame my question, first I have to quickly define a concept that I've been thinking about a lot lately: the canonical rewind point. The point in a franchise where things have gone so far off the rails that a successful reboot has to go back to an earlier point in the series. There are possibly two parts to this. First, the last straw moment, so the moment at which you say, oh, that's the point at which everything went off the rails. And second, the point you go back to before it all started going wrong. So where do you actually go back to start things all over again if you're going to do a canonical rewind? And I guess the other aspect of this, Shefflin, is can you even go back? Like, what if your actors are now too old to play characters or their characters in the place in the timeline that you want to go back to? Or what if they're actually dead and so they can't play those characters anymore? The thing that made me think about this initially was the Terminator reboot idea going all the way back to T2. And Doctor Who has obviously hit a similar point along with Star Trek and Star Wars. So my question is this: how many of our popular cinematic or TV franchises have passed this point where they need a rewind, and where should we begin afresh? Cheers, Shefflin. Shefflin, thanks for your email. We should catch up again next time in Wellington for another drink. That was great last time. So I've compiled this list because your question got me thinking, well, what about the franchises that are in trouble and that really do need some sort of rewind? And so I compiled a list, and I didn't even include any television. Apart from Doctor Who, I didn't put any television on my list because it seems that television has had this problem for a long time, and I think probably it makes sense that television would suffer or would be more at risk of this, because television in a series, you have to churn out so much content. It's effectively like producing somewhere between 6 and 12 movies or worth of content over one season. And so you can see why they're more prone to this, because in films there tends to be a period between each sort of 1.5 hour, 2 hour installment in that franchise. So I focused primarily on movie franchises, and it seems that this has become a monumental problem because with each passing year it seems more and more franchises are starting to sink themselves into this quagmire, this creative black hole. So here's the list I came up with, and this is not exhaustive. Star Wars is in trouble, Star Trek, Doctor Who, obviously a TV series, Terminator. Who would have thought the once great Terminator franchise would have ended up where it's ended up of late? Aliens, the Tolkien universe, I'm calling it, because Lord of the Rings, that trilogy was phenomenal, but The Hobbit, man, it would be great to have a bit of a canonical rewind of that, wouldn't it? The Die Hard series, Ghostbusters, Batman and the sort of, I guess, the DC extended universe, and then Indiana Jones. Now, Indiana Jones, this is a fascinating case study, because Indiana Jones, that original trilogy of films, was really just this perfectly bookended franchise. You had a strong opening cinematic outing, and then you had a middle film that was probably the weakest of the three. It was still enjoyable though. And then you had that final film, goes back to form, produces a strong third and final installment, and then just bookends nicely and closes it off with everyone riding off into the sunset together. It was so perfect. And then they go back for the fourth film, which, while not incompetent, it just felt like a paint by numbers and very soulless sort of presentation of those characters. It wasn't really much of an addition to that franchise at all. The only franchise I could think of which is really kind of bucking this trend, and in a big way really, and is like a fine wine, is getting much better with age, is the Mission Impossible franchise. And I talked about that in an episode of The Daily Question about a week or so back. So the question is, how many of these things are facing this problem? I think a lot of them are. And then how do we go back, and can we do it? And your question really got me thinking about perhaps franchises that have successfully done this. Obviously, one recent example, it seems, is the Halloween franchise. The latest Halloween installment is a movie that's just said, hey, I'm going to pretend those other films don't exist and I'm just going to go all the way back. And it seems to have done it relatively successfully. It's not, you know, the pinnacle of filmmaking by any stretch of the imagination, but it does seem to have done that relatively successfully. There, of course, is, I think, the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy is an example of this, because if you think about what was happening in the Batman franchise before that point, things had really gone off the rails. The last two films in the franchise were not the greatest, and the last one in particular was just comedically laughable. And then along comes Christopher Nolan, and effectively what he does there is he creates a whole new canon. Yeah, he's rebooting this thing, but he is creating a whole new canon here. This whole question, I guess, raises a fascinating and I think important question, and that is once you have a piece of art that is created and it exists now in the world, who owns that piece of art? Because in a sense, even if you have a canonical rewind point, those other films, that they still exist out there. I mean, even if you were to try and hunt them all down and destroy them, which would obviously be pretty impossible in the digital age, but let's say you could somehow manage to do that. People have seen those, they know they exist, they would still talk about those, they would still be part of people's memories. And so it's kind of an interesting question. Who owns the art? Who is it? The artist obviously owns the creative vision that sort of births this thing and brings it into the world. But then once it's owned, once it's in the world, sort of where does the ownership lie? Because in a sense, we all now have a stake in it, all of us who have participated in this piece of art anyway, who've gone to view it. And it's not like you can sort of just say, all right, we want you all now to forget what you've just seen. It no longer exists. Because in a sense, we now have an ownership of it as observers, and we can say, well, no thanks, we're not gonna forget that it exists, and we're not gonna let you destroy it effectively from our version of the canon. We'll keep it alive. So it would be interesting to see how you could make a canonical rewind point work in the real world, where you probably are going to have, you know, splits in the fan base where people are going to say, no, you can't get rid of that, we like that, and they effectively still hold on to it. And the way art exists in the world, I'm not sure you could ever prevent that from happening. But it does seem to me that the biggest sort of problem here is the obsession that we've developed with reboots and remakes and cinematic universes. And it's really only Marvel that is doing this particularly well as far as building whole universes. But it now seems that a lot of other people or studios have become obsessed with these ideas as well of trying to, and probably primarily for financial gain. But what's happening is it's effectively, you're creating a system, if you like, that is ultimately is doomed to failure, because the more you oversaturate the market with something, the more you saturate people with something, even if that thing is a good and creative thing, people are going to grow probably bored by it. It's not really something that can keep piquing people's interests. And I think creativity tends to falter as well, because you try and make your artists fit into a pre-existing vision, and a pre-existing vision that is often very tightly prescribed, and again along financial lines for financial gain. So it really is sort of a creative formula that's destined to failure, but it's become a really big problem now. This whole idea of constantly rebooting things, constantly remaking things, and I don't know if we want to add to that problem. It seems that we have a big creative bankruptcy now when it comes to filmmaking, and I guess the question is, like, why is this? Why do we have this creative bankruptcy? And I think part of it is that as a culture, and particularly in the West, we are no longer in touch with the big stories. I mean, the things like human existence and human meaning and religion and God and all those big questions, the big narratives, if you like, which once played such a huge role in society, and they help to inform the smaller narratives and you know, the stories that we tell, the fables, the myths, the mythology, right? And all of that stuff is informed by that, and movies are a part of that. And so once that stuff is missing from your culture, I think the tendency is that you get very small and minimalistic and reductionist, and your creative output, I think, often reflects that. I think also there's this hedonistic nihilism, and that doesn't really bode well for mythology or for storytelling. And I think also in a culture of self-gratification, we tend to get bored very, very quickly because we're just looking for the next thing that will gratify us. Quick, give us another one of those movies. Quick, give us one of those things. I want another story. Give me stories, lots of stories. I want to be entertained. We're always looking for that gratification fix. Now, the interesting thing is if you go back to, say, my parents' or grandparents' generation, their creative content, the things that they enjoyed and immersed themselves in, like, say, their favourite books, they might have sort of 2, 3 stories that they loved, and they would just read them over and over again. They might have a couple of favourite movies that they would just watch over and over again. It wasn't this obsession with, we must have a new movie every week or a new movie every month. And I think that's part of the problem too, with this obsession with constantly oversaturating things. And basically, though, we've got this problem that we're not really creative in our cinematic storytelling anymore, I think. It's all, or I don't know whether we're so obsessed with money or we're just too afraid to take a risk now and to allow people to tell other stories beyond just these pre-existing franchises that were once, say, successful 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, whatever it is. And now we're like, we just got to keep going back there because that worked and that was successful. So let's just keep riding on the back of that, or let's take that and steal that and stick that in a new generation. I think the other problem too, of course, is the ideological propaganda bandwagon stuff where people see a successful franchise and they say, hey, this is a really good vehicle because it's so culturally popular. A lot of people like this. Let's take this and use this as a vehicle for our ideological propaganda. We will teach people, we will theologize them, if you like, through this artistic vehicle. And when that happens, creativity obviously suffers and it just corrupts the whole process. And I think it drives a lot of fans away and tends to ruin what's going on in a franchise. So I guess in a nutshell, I've gone everywhere, under, over, and all around your question. But I don't know, can you canonically rewind? Would people accept that? Can you actually get away with that in the modern context? Should we be trying to do that? Or should we be actually saying, okay, maybe what we need to do is start encouraging more new, original stories and saying to people, hey, tell us what your new and original ideas are, not what your ideas are for how you would take an already existing, someone else's original idea and just add to that. What can you do to actually bring to the world that's new and creative? As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There is a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.